going to head out to Jockey Hollow, and we're going to see what life was like for the soldiers during what the Army called the hard winter. So let's take a ride. We're now in what's called Jockey Hollow. This was originally owned by Henry Wick, and it encompassed 1,400 acres. So this was a perfect location for Washington's army. His army is approximately 10,000 men. What makes this area so perfect is A, all the trees, because the men wind up living in huts. The trees are cut down, about 600 acres worth of trees are cut down and then made into cabins, approximately 1,200 cabins for 10,000 men. So this area was perfect for that. Also, of course, you need water for all of these men, and there are all kinds of streams around here, etc. We're now in Jockey Hollow, and of course, Morris Township, New Jersey at this point, just outside of Morristown. And this is where Washington's army camped during the hard winter, as the soldiers called it. Behind me are replica cabins of what the Army soldiers lived in. So this whole 1,400 acre area was really trees. And the Army cuts down these trees and builds, as I said earlier, approximately 1,200 of these cabins for the soldiers to live in. Now, they called it the hard winter because it was the coldest winter to this day on record. Something like 28 major snowstorms. I mean, we go crazy if we have 2, 28. There was a point in time where the temperature never got above 0, and that was almost for a month. It was so cold that all of the major waterways, actually the minor ones too, between New England and North Carolina were frozen solid. Think about that for a second. You ever want to walk on water? Well, here was your chance to do it, and people did do it. So we're going to walk up to the cabins. We're going to talk more about the cabins and the men living here. And then, as promised, I'm going to talk about the attempted kidnapping of George Washington and how the weather played a major part in that. So follow me. We see this big cleared area, and up on top are the cabins. But I have to think that in early 1780, when the soldiers were here, we're talking 10,000 soldiers. I mean, the population of Morristown was about 250. And here we've got 10,000 soldiers. This area that is cleared out here, my guess is this was all trees, as was probably the entire 1,400 acre area. So imagine cutting down enough trees to build approximately 1,200 cabins. So there are other areas like this here in Jockey Hollow that in all probability were filled with trees. One of the really important things of this area of Jockey Hollow is, of course, the trees, the water, the proximity to the Ford mansions, about, as I said, about maybe 3 to 4 miles. Of course, today we drive. Back then would have been on horses. Usually militarily, the officers here some of them would go to the Ford mansion in the morning to get their orders, but there would always be back and forth. So we're climbing up here. It's a beautiful view, by the way, from up here. And you can see the cabins that I'm approaching. These were, the Pennsylvania line was up here. Usually, especially in the beginning, but even 1780, the Army was still composed to a large extent of militia. And they tried to keep the militia together from the states. So I'm sitting in one of the officers' huts, and it's kind of an interesting feeling. You see, I was in the Army, and I was an officer. So here I am, circa 1780, and I don't know, it's kind of neat in a way. So the officers' huts were different than the huts that the soldiers stayed in. The soldiers' huts, there were specific dimensions. Those huts were laid out in a specific order. The officers' huts, they were not subject to those same requirements. And depending on your rank, you may have a hut to yourself. You may share it only with one other officer. Of course, you have your fireplace, and of course, all the trees. Remember, we've spoken about the trees. These trees, besides being needed to build these huts, you need it for the fire. You need it because of that winter, the brutally, brutally cold winter. You know, living here in New Jersey, people hear a lot more about Valley Forge that winter than they do about the winter here in Morristown. Now, not to take anything away from Valley Forge, some really important things happened there. Just to name one, the arrival of Baron von Steuben. But the weather here in this second winter encampment was far, far, far worse than Valley Forge. So we're going to take a walk now and take a look at one of the camps, or one of the huts, that the average soldier would be in, and I'm going to talk to you about the kidnapping, or the attempted kidnapping, of George Washington, which happened, or tried to happen, because of the weather, and that's why I'm talking about it out here. So I'm inside a typical cabin that soldiers would stay in, the enlisted men. These cabins were all very specific in their size, in their shape, in their location. Each cabin slept 12 people. You can see here the fireplace. And this was it. Now, I'm dressed for winter. Today, with the wind, it's in the mid-20s. When the soldiers were here, it was 0 degrees for at least a month, and the entire winter it was brutal. And remember, the soldiers had very little in the way of clothing. Some of them didn't even have shoes. They literally wore rags wrapped around their feet. Food was always an issue. It's amazing that the Army stayed together as well as it did. So as promised, let's talk about the attempt to kidnap George Washington, which was a large part of which is because of the weather. Now, the weather was so cold, as I had mentioned, that the waterways from New England down to North Carolina on the East Coast were all frozen solid, and I mean frozen solid. So the British have an army on Staten Island, and they come up with the idea of kidnapping George Washington. And what they're going to do is they're going to walk, or if on horses, depending on which direction they're going in. The British are going to come to New Jersey from Staten Island with the goal of kidnapping George Washington, because he's at the Ford Mansion, the Army is over here, and the British say, you know, Washington is lightly guarded. Plus, New York Harbor, Newark Bay, Hudson River is frozen solid. So the idea is they literally walk across New York Harbor, and some of them rode their horses. Can you imagine that? Any of you ever think about walking on water? Well, here's your chance. So they get to New Jersey. Now picture this. I don't know how many of the major snowstorms had already happened, but there was a huge amount of snow on the ground. Could be 6 feet of snow, could be 8 feet of snow. The weather, 0 degrees for a month, brutal winds. So they come across New Jersey, the water, and they get to New Jersey. There's some diversionary things, but the main group of men whose assignment is to kidnap Washington, they can't find Morristown. Think about that for a second. They can't find Morristown. The snow drifts are so deep. And it's not like there are road signs, or that, you know, they're holding an iPhone with a navigation system. So they spend literally 24 hours trying to figure out how to get to Morristown. Some of the soldiers are now starting to get frostbite, and they gave up, and they walk across or ride their horses across New York Harbor back to Staten Island. So the weather, in a way, gave the British the opportunity, yet at the same time, the weather prohibited the actual kidnapping of George Washington. We're going to wrap this up. First of all, I want to thank everybody for watching. If you ever find yourself in northern New Jersey or nearby, even Manhattan, come to Morristown, New Jersey. There's so much history here. And so we hope to see you someday. Meanwhile, I want to leave you with my Revolutionary War riddle. Where else are you going to find a riddle about the American Revolution? So it goes like this. Politically, if you wanted to separate from the crown, you were called a Whig. That's spelled W-H-I-G. Think, political parties. And if you wanted to stay loyal, you were called a Tory, T-O-R-Y. So here's the riddle. What was the Whigs' favorite food? Let me just say it again. What was the Whigs' favorite food? Now, if you think you know the answer, or if you want to know the answer, send me an email. I will answer every email with the correct answer. I hope that you have enjoyed this little video, and we look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Thank you.